Carlos Castanada's The Eagle's Gift, Chapter 3, The Eagle's Gift, Part 10, The Naguals Party of Warriors. When Don Juan judged that the time was right for me to have my first encounter with his warriors, he made me shift levels of awareness. He then made it perfectly clear that he would have nothing to do with their way of meeting with me. He warned me that if they decided to beat me, he could not stop them. They could do anything they wanted except kill me. He stressed over and over again that the warriors of his party were a perfect replica of his benefactors, except that some of the women were more fierce and all of the men were utterly unique and powerful. Therefore, my first encounter with them might resemble a head-on collision. I was nervous and apprehensive on the one hand, but curious on the other. My mind was running wild with endless speculations, most of them about what the warriors would look like. Don Juan said he had the choice either of coaching me to memorize an elaborate ritual, as he had been made to do, or of making it the most casual encounter possible. He waited for an omen to point out which alternative to take. His benefactor had done something similar, only he had insisted Don Juan learn the ritual before the omen presented itself. When Don Juan revealed his sexual daydreams of sleeping with 4 women, his benefactor interpreted it as the omen, chucked the ritual, and ended up pleading like a hog dealer for Don Juan's life. In my case, Don Juan wanted an omen before he taught me the ritual. The omen came when Don Juan and I were driving through a border town in Arizona, and a policeman stopped me. The policeman thought I was an illegal alien. Only after I had shown him my passport, which he suspected of being a forgery, and other documents, did he let me go. Don Juan had been in the front seat next to me all the time, and the policeman had not given him a second glance. He had focused solely on me. Don Juan thought the incident was the omen he was waiting for. His interpretation of it was that it would be very dangerous for me to call attention to myself, and he concluded that my world had to be one of utter simplicity and candor. Elaborate ritual and pomp were out of character for me. He conceded, however, that a minimal observance of ritualistic patterns was in order when I made my acquaintance with his warriors. It had to begin by approaching them from the south, because that is the direction that power flows in its ceaseless flux. Life force flows to us from the south and leaves us flowing toward the north. He said that the only opening to a Nagual's world was through the south, and that the gate was made by 2 female warriors who would have to greet me and let me go through if they so decided. He took me to a town in central Mexico, to a house in the countryside. As we approached it on foot from a southerly direction, I saw 2 massive Indian women standing 4 feet apart, facing each other. They were about 30 to 40 feet away from the main door of the house in an area where the dirt was hard-packed. The 2 women were extraordinarily muscular and stern. Both had long jet-black hair held together in a single thick braid. They looked like sisters. They were about the same height and weight. I figured that they must have been around 5 feet 4 and weighed 150 pounds. One of them was extremely dark, almost black. The other much lighter. They were dressed like typical Indian women from central Mexico. Long, full dresses and shawls and homemade sandals. Don Juan made me stop 3 feet from them. He turned to the woman on our left and made me face her. The woman on our left and made me face her. He said that her name was Celia, and that she was a dreamer. He then turned abruptly without giving me time to say anything and made me face the darker woman to our right. He said that her name was Delia and that she was a stalker. The woman nodded at me. They did not smile or move to shake hands with me or make any gesture of welcome. Don Juan walked between them as if they were 2 columns making a gate. He took a couple of steps, turned as if waiting for the woman to invite me to go through. The woman stared at me calmly for a moment. Then Celia asked me to come in, as if I were at the threshold of an actual door. Don Juan led the way to the house. At the front door we found a man. he was very slender. At the first sight he looked extremely young, but on closer examination he appeared to be in his late 50s. He gave me the impression of being an old child, small, wiry, with penetrating dark eyes. He was like an elfish apparition, a shadow. Don Juan introduced him to me as Emilito, and said that he was his courier, an all-round helper, who would welcome me on his behalf. It seemed to me that Emilito was indeed the most appropriate being to welcome anyone. His smile was radiant, his small teeth were perfectly even. He shook hands with me, or rather, he crossed his forearms and clasped both my hands. He seemed to be exuding enjoyment. Anyone would have sworn that he was ecstatic in meeting me. His voice was very soft, and his eyes sparkled. We walked into a large room. There was another woman there. Don Juan said that her name was Teresa, and that she was Celia and Delia's courier. She was perhaps in her early 30s and was definitely looked like Celia's daughter. She was very quiet but very friendly. We followed Don Juan to the back of the house, where there was a roofed porch. It was a warm day. We sat around the table, and after a frugal dinner we talked until after midnight. Emilito was the host. He charmed and delighted everyone with his esoteric stories. The women opened up. They were a great audience for him. To hear the woman's laughter was an exquisite pleasure. They were tremendously muscular, bold, and physical. At one point, when Emilito said that Celia and Delia were like two mothers to him, Teresa like a daughter, they picked him up and tossed him in the air like a child. Of the two women, Delia seemed the more rational, down-to-earth. Celia was perhaps more aloof, but appeared to have a great inner strength. She gave me the impression of being more intolerant or more impatient. She seemed to get annoyed with some of Emilito's stories. Nonetheless, she was definitely on the edge of her chair when he would tell what he called his tales of eternity. He would preface every story with the phrase, "Do you, dear friends, know that?" The story that impressed me the most was about some creatures that he said existed in the universe, who were the closest thing to human beings without being human. Creatures who were obsessed with movement and capable of detecting the slightest fluctuation inside themselves or around them. These creatures were so sensitive to motion that it was a curse to them. It gave them such pain that their ultimate ambition was to find quiet. Emilito would intersperse his tales of eternity with the most outrageous dirty jokes. Because of his incredible gifts as a raconteur, I understood every one of his stories as a metaphor, a parable, with which he was teaching us something. Don Juan said that Emilito was merely reporting about things he had witnessed in his journeys through eternity. The role of a courier was to travel ahead of the Nagual, like a scout in a military operation. Emilito went to limits of the second attention, and whatever he witnessed, he passed on to the others. My second encounter with Don Juan's warriors was just as contrived as the first. One day, Don Juan made me shift levels of awareness and told me that I had a second appointment. He made me drive to Zacatecas in northern Mexico. We arrived there early in the morning. Don Juan said that it was only a stopover and that we had until the next day to relax before we embarked on my second formal meeting to make the acquaintance of the Eastern woman and the scholar warrior of his party. He explained then an intricate and delicate point of choice. He said that we had met the South and the courier in the mid-afternoon because he had made an individual interpretation of the rule and had picked that hour to represent the night. The South was really the night, a warm, friendly, cozy night, and properly we should have gone to meet the two southerly women after midnight. However, that would have been inauspicious for me because my general direction was toward the light, toward optimism, an optimism that works itself harmoniously into the mystery of darkness. He said that that was precisely what he had done that day. We had enjoyed each other's company and talked until it was pitch black. I had wondered why, they did not light their lanterns. Don Juan said that the east, on the other hand, was the morning, the light, and they would meet the easterly woman the next day at mid-morning. Before breakfast, we went to the plaza and sat down on a bench. Don Juan told me that he wanted me to remain there and wait for him while he ran some errands. He left, and shortly after he had gone, a woman came and sat down on the other end of the bench. I did not pay any attention to her and started reading a newspaper. A moment later, another woman joined her. I wanted to move to another bench, but I remembered that Don Juan had specifically said that I should sit there. I turned my back to the woman and had even forgotten that they were there, since they were so quiet. When a man greeted me and stood facing me, I became aware from their conversation that the woman had been waiting for him. The man apologized for being late. He obviously wanted to sit down. I slid over to make room for him. He thanked me profusely and apologized for inconveniencing me. He said that they were absolutely lost in the city because they were rural people, and that once they had been in Mexico City and had nearly died in the traffic. He asked me if I lived in Zacatecas. I said no, and was going to end our conversation right there. But there was something very winning about his smile. He was an old man, remarkably fit for his age. He was not an Indian. He seemed to be a gentleman farmer from a small rural town. He was wearing a suit and had a straw hat on. His features were very delicate. His skin was almost transparent. He had a high-bridged nose, a small mouth, and a perfectly groomed white beard. He looked extraordinarily healthy, yet he seemed frail. He was of medium height and well-built, but at the same time gave the impression of being slender, almost effete. He stood up and introduced himself to me. He told me that his name was Vicente Medrano, and that he had come to the city on business only for the day. He then pointed to the two women and said that they were his sisters. The women stood up and faced us. They were very slim, darker than their brother. They were also much younger. One of them could have been his daughter. I noticed that their skin was not like his. Theirs was dry. The two women were very good-looking. Like the man, they had fine features, and their eyes were clear and peaceful. They were about 5'4". They were wearing beautifully tailored dresses, but with their shawls, low heels, and dark cotton stockings. They looked like well-to-do farm women. The older one appeared to be in her 50s, and the younger one in her 40s. The man introduced them to me. The older woman was named Carmela, the younger one, Hermelinda. I stood up and briefly shook hands with them. I asked them if they had any children. That question was usually a conversation opener for me. The women laughed and in unison ran their hands down their stomachs to show me how lean they were. The man calmly explained that his sisters were spinsters, and that he himself was an old bachelor. He confided to me, in a half-joking tone, that unfortunately his sisters were too mannish. They lacked the femininity that makes women desirable, so they had been unable to find husbands. I said that they were better off considering the subservient role of women in our society. The women disagreed with me. They said that they would not have minded at all being servants if they had only found men who wanted to be their masters. The younger one said that the real problem was that their father had failed to teach them to behave like women. The man commented with a sigh that their father was too domineering, that he had also prevented him from marrying by deliberately neglecting to teach him how to be macho. All three of them sighed and looked gloomily. I wanted to laugh. After a long silence, we sat down again, and the man said that if I stayed a while longer on the bench, I would have a chance to meet their father, who was still very spirited for his advanced age. He added in a shy tone that their father was going to take them to eat breakfast, because they themselves never carried any money. Their father handled the purse strings. I was aghast. Those old people who looked so strong were in reality like weak, dependent children. I said goodbye to them and got up to leave. The man and his sisters insisted that I stay. They assured me that their father would love it if I would join them for breakfast. I did not want to meet their father, yet I was curious. I told them that I myself was waiting for someone. At that At that, the woman began to chuckle, and they broke into roaring laughter. The man was also abandoned himself to uncontained laughter. I felt stupid. I wanted to get out of there. At that moment, Don Juan showed up, and I became aware of their maneuver. I did not think it was amusing. All of us stood up. They were laughing as Don Juan told me that those women were the East, that Carmelina was the stalker and Hermelinda the dreamer, and that Vicente was the warrior scholar and his oldest companion. Oh, here's Daisy. All of us stood up. They were still laughing as Don Juan... Do I have to put you on the camera here? Can you do that yourself? I gotta do this, Daisy. All of us stood up. We were still laughing as Don Juan told me that those women were the East, and that Carmela was the stalker and Hermelin the dream. As we were leaving the plaza, another man joined us, a tall, dark Indian, perhaps in his 40s. You're not getting up, Daisy. He was wearing Levi's and a cowboy hat. He seemed terribly strong and sullen. Don Juan introduced him to me as Juan Tuma, Vicente's courier and research assistant. We walked to a restaurant a few blocks away. The women held me between them. Carmelita said that she hoped I was not offended by their joke, that they had had the choice of just introducing themselves to me or kidding me. What made them decide to kid me was my thoroughly snobbish attitude in turning my back to them and wanting to move to another bench. Hermelinda added that one has to be utterly humble and carry nothing to defend, not even one's person, that one's person should be protected but not defended. In snubbing them, I was not protecting but merely defending myself. I felt quarrelsome. I was frankly put out by their masquerade. I began to argue, but before I had made my point, Don Juan came to my side. He told the two women that they should overlook my belligerence, that it takes a very long time to clean out the garbage that a luminous being picks up in the world. The owner of the restaurant where we went knew Vicente and had prepared a sumptuous breakfast for us. All of them were in great spirits, but I was unable to let go of my brooding. Then at Don Juan's request, Juan Tuma began to talk about his journeys. He was a factual man. I became mesmerized by his dry accounts of things beyond my comprehension. To me, the most fascinating was his description of some beams of light or energy that allegedly crisscrossed the earth. He said that these beams did not fluctuate as everything else in the universe does, but are fixed into a pattern. This pattern coincides with hundreds of points in the luminous body. Hermelinda had understood that all the points were in our physical body, but Juan Tuma explained that since the luminous body is quite big, some of the points are as much as 3 feet away from the physical body. In a sense, they are outside of us, yet they are not. They are on the periphery of our luminosity, and thus they still belong to the total body. The most important of these points is located a foot away from the stomach, 40 degrees to the right of an imaginary line shooting straight forward. Juan Tuma told us that that was a center of assembling for the second attention. In other words, it's second attention assemblage point, and that it is possible to manipulate it by gently stroking the air with the palms of the hands. Listening to Juan Tuma, I forgot my anger. My next encounter with Don Juan's world was with the West. He gave me ample warning that the first contact with the West was a most important event, because it would decide one way or another what I should subsequently do. He also altered me to the fact that it was going to be, Daisy, I wish you'd screw. You're screwing me up here. Because it would decide in one way or another what I should subsequently do. No, Daisy, you can't get up. He also alerted me to the fact that it was going to be a trying event, especially for me, as if I was so stiff and felt so self-important. He said that the West is naturally approached at dusk, a time of the day which is difficult just in itself. that his warriors of the West were very powerful, bold, and downright maddening. At the same time, I was also going to meet the male warrior who was the man behind the scenes. Don Juan admonished me to exercise the utmost caution and patience. Not only were the women raving mad, but they and the man were the most powerful warriors he had ever known. They were, in his opinion, there she is, you get her up there? All right. The ultimate authorities of the second attention. Don Juan did not elaborate any further. One day, as though on the spur of the moment, he suddenly decided that it was time to start our trip to meet the westerly women. We moved to a city in northern Mexico just at dusk. We drove to a city. Don Juan directed me to stop in front of a big unlit house on the outskirts of town. We got out of the car, walked to the main door. Don Juan knocked several times. No one answered. I had the feeling that we had come at the wrong time. The house seemed empty. Don Juan kept on knocking until he apparently got tired. He signaled me to knock. He told me to keep on doing it without stopping, because the people who lived in there were hard of hearing. I asked him if it would be better to return later or the next day. He told me to keep on banging on the door. After a seemingly endless wait, the door began to open slowly. A weird-looking woman stuck her head out and asked me if my intention was to break down the door or anger the neighbors and their dogs. Don Juan stepped forward to say something. The woman stepped out and forcefully brushed me aside. She began to shake her finger at me, yelling that I was behaving as if I owned the world, as if there was no one else besides myself. I protested that I was merely doing what Don Juan had told me to do. The woman asked me if I had been told to break down the door. Don Juan tried to intervene, but was again brushed away. The woman looked as if she had just gotten out of bed. She was a mess. Our knocking had probably awakened her, and she must have put on a dress for her basket or her from her basket of dirty clothes. She was barefoot, her hair was graying and terribly unkempt. She had red, beady eyes. She was a homely woman, but somehow very impressive, rather tall, about 5'8", dark and enormously muscular. Her arms were knotted with hard muscles. I noticed she had beautiful shaped calves. She looked at me up and down, towering over me, and shouted that she had not heard my apologies. Don Juan whispered to me that I should apologize loud and clear. She looked up at me. She looked me up and down, towering over me, shouted that she had not heard my apologies. Don Juan whispered to me that I should apologize loud and clear. Once I had done that, the woman smiled and turned to Don Juan and hugged me as if he were a child. She grumbled that he should not have made me knock because my touch on the door was too shifty and disturbing. She held Don Juan's arm and led him inside, helping him over the high threshold. She called him the dearest little old man. Don Juan laughed. I was appalled to see him acting as if he were delighted at the absurdities of that scary woman. Once she had helped the dearest little old man into the house, she turned to me and made a gesture with her hand to shoo me away as if I were a dog. She laughed at my surprise. Her teeth were big and uneven and filthy. Then she seemed to change her mind and told me to come in. Don Juan was heading to a door that I could barely see at the end of a dark hall. The woman scolded him for not knowing where he was going. She took us through another dark hall. The house seemed to be enormous, and there was not a single light in it. The woman opened the door to a very strange room, almost empty except for 2 old armchairs in the center under the weakest light bulb I had ever seen. It was an old-fashioned long bulb. Another woman was sitting in one of the armchairs. The first woman sat down on a small straw mat on the floor, rested her back against the other chair. Then she put her thighs against her breast, exposing herself completely. She was not wearing underpants. I stared at her, dumbfounded. In an ugly, gruff tone, the woman asked me why I was staring at her vagina. I did not know what to say except to deny it. She stood up and seemed about to hit me. She demanded that I tell her that I had gaped at her because I had never seen a vagina in my life. I was thoroughly embarrassed. and also annoyed at having been caught in such a situation. The woman asked Don Juan what kind of Nagual I was, if I had never seen a vagina. He began repeating this over and over, yelling it at the top of her voice. She ran around the room and stopped by the chair where the other woman was sitting. She shook her by the shoulders and pointed at me and said that I was a man who had never seen a vagina in his whole life. She laughed and taunted me. I was mortified. I felt that Don Juan should have done something to save me from that humiliation. I remember that he had told me these women were quite mad. He had understated it. These women were ready for an institution. I looked at Don Juan for support and advice. He looked away. He seemed to be equally at a loss, although I thought I caught a malicious smile, which he quickly hid by turning his head. The woman lay down on her back, pulled up her skirt, and commanded me to look to my heart's content instead of sneaking glances. My face must have been red, judging by the heat in my head and neck. I was so annoyed that I almost lost control. I felt like bashing her head in. The woman who was sitting in the chair suddenly stood up and grabbed the other one by the hair and made her stand up in one single motion. Seemingly with no effort at all, she stared at me through half-closed eyes, bringing her face no more than 2 or 3 inches from mine. She smelled surprisingly fresh. In a high-pitched voice, she said that we should get down to business. Both the women stood close to me under the light bulb. They did not look alike. The second woman was older, or looked older, and her face was covered by a thick coat of cosmetic powder that gave her a clownish appearance. Her hair was neatly arranged in a chignon, which is a ball of hair, by the way. I had to look that up. She seemed calm except for a continuous tremor in her lower lip and chin. Both women were equally tall and strong-looking. They towered menacingly over me and stared at me for a long time. Don Juan did not do anything to break their fixation. The older woman nodded her head, and Don Juan told me that her name was Zulika and that she was a dreamer. The woman who had opened the door was named Zolila, and she was a stalker. Zulika turned to me in a parrot-like voice, asked me if it was true that I had never seen a vagina. Don Juan could not hold his composure any longer and began to laugh. With a gesture, I signaled him that I did not know what to say. He whispered in my ear that it would be better for me to say that I had not, otherwise I should be prepared to describe a vagina, because that was what Zulika would demand that I do next. I answered accordingly. Zulika said that she felt sorry for me. She then ordered Zolia to show me her vagina. Zolia lay down on her back under the light bulb and opened her legs. Don Juan was laughing and coughing. I begged him to get me out of that madhouse. He whispered in my ear again that I had better take a good look and appear attentive or interested, because if I did not, we would have to stay there until kingdom come. After my careful and attentive examination, Zulika said that from then on I could brag that I was a connoisseur, that if I ever stumbled upon a woman without her pants, I would not be so coarse and obscene as to let my eyes pop out of their sockets, because now I had seen a vagina. Zulika very quietly led us to the patio. She whispered that there was someone out there waiting to meet me. The patio was pitch black. I could hardly make out the silhouettes of the others. Then I saw the dark outline of a man standing a few feet away from me. My body experienced an involuntary jolt. Don Juan spoke to the man in a very low voice, saying that he had brought me to meet him. He told the man my name. After a moment's silence, Don Juan said to me that the man's name was Silvio Manuel, and that he was the warrior of darkness and the actual leader of the whole warriors party. Then Silvio Manuel spoke to me. I thought that he must have had a speech disorder. His voice was muffled, and the words came out of him like spurts of soft coughing. He ordered me to come closer. As I tried to approach him, he receded, just as if he were floating. He led me into an even darker recess of a hall, walking, it seemed, noiselessly backwards. He muttered something I could not understand. I wanted to speak. My throat itched and was parched. He repeated something 2 or 3 times until it dawned on me that he was ordering me to undress. There was something overpowering about his voice and the darkness around him. I was incapable of disobeying. I took off my clothes and stood stark naked, shivering with fear and cold. It was so dark that I could not see if Don Juan and the other 2 women were around. I heard a soft, prolonged hissing from a source a few feet away from me. Then I felt a cool breeze. I realized that Silvio Manuel was exhaling his breath all over my body. He then asked me to sit on my clothes and look at a bright point which I could easily distinguish in the darkness, a point that seemed to give out a faint amber light. I stared at it for what seemed hours, until I suddenly realized that the point of brightness was Silvio Manuel's left eye. I could then make out the contour of his whole face and his body. The hall was not as dark as it had seemed. Silvio Manuel advanced to me and helped me up. To see in the dark, which with such clarity enthralled me. I did not even mind that I was naked, or that, as I then saw, the 2 women were watching me. Apparently they could also see in the dark. They were staring at me. I wanted to put on my pants, but Zoila snatched them out of my hands. The 2 women and Silvio Manuel stared at me for a long time. Then Don Juan came out of nowhere, handed me my shoes, and Zoila led us through a corridor to an open patio with trees. I made out the dark silhouettes of a woman standing in the middle of the patio. Don Juan spoke to her, and she mumbled something in reply. He told me that she was a southerly woman, and that her name was Marta, and that she was a courier to the 2 westerly women. Marta said that she could bet I had never been introduced to a woman while I was naked, that the normal procedure is to get acquainted and then get undressed. She laughed out loud. Her laughter was so pleasing, so clear and youthful, that it sent chills through me. It reverberated throughout the whole house, enhanced by the darkness and the silence there. I looked to Don Juan for support. He was gone, and so was Silvio Manuel. I was alone with the 3 women. I became very nervous and asked Marta if she knew where Don Juan had gone. At that precise moment, someone grabbed the skin of my armpits. I yelled in pain. I knew that it was Silvio Manuel. He lifted me up as if I weighed nothing and shook my shoes off me. Then he stood me in a shallow tub of ice-cold water that came up to my knees. I remained in that tub for a long time, while all of them scrutinized me. Then Silvio Manuel lifted me up again and set me down next to my shoes, which someone had neatly placed next to the tub. Don Juan again came out of nowhere and handed me my clothes. He whispered that I should put them on and stay only long enough to be polite. Marta gave me a towel to dry myself. I looked around for the other 2 women and Silvio Manuel, but they were nowhere in sight. Marta, Don Juan, and I stood in the darkness talking for a long time. She seemed to be speaking mainly to Don Juan, but I believed that I was her real audience. I waited for a clue from Don Juan to leave, but he appeared to be enjoying Marta's agile conversation. She told him that Zolia and Zulika had been at the peak of their madness that day. Then she added, for my benefit, that they were extremely rational most of the time. As if she were revealing a secret, Marta told us that the reason Zolila's hair looked so unkempt was because at least 1/3 of it was Zulika's hair. What had happened was that the 2 of them had had a moment of intense camaraderie and were helping one another groom their hair. Zulika braided Zolia's hair as she had done hundreds of times, except that, being out of control, she had braided portions of her own hair in with Zolia's. Marta said that when they got up from their chairs, they went into a commotion. She ran in to the rescue, but by the time she entered the room, Zulika had taken over, and since she was a bit more lucid than Zolia that day, she had decided to cut the portion of Zolia's hair that was braided to hers. She got confused in the melee that ensued and cut her own hair instead. Don Juan was laughing as if it were the funniest thing ever. I heard a soft cough-like burst of laughter coming from the darkness on the far side of the patio. Martha added that she had to improvise a chignon, a ball of hair, until Zuleika's hair grew out. I laughed along with Don Juan. I liked Martha. The two other women were abhorrent to me. They gave me a sensation of nausea. Martha, on the other hand, seemed to be a paragon of calm and silent purpose. I could not see her features, but I imagined her to be very beautiful. The sound of her voice was haunting. She was very polite. She very politely asked Don Juan if I would accept something to eat. He replied that I did not feel comfortable with Zuleika or Zoila, and that I would probably get sick to my stomach. Martha assured me that the two women were gone, and they took my arm and led us through the darkest hall yet into a well-lit room, into a well-lit kitchen. Miss Daisy, you hungry? The contrast was too great for my eyes. I stood in the doorway, trying to get used to the light. The kitchen had a very high ceiling. It was fairly modern and adequate. We sat in a short dinette area. Martha was young and very strong. She had a plump, voluptuous figure, a round face, and a small nose and mouth. Her jet black hair was braided and coiled around her head. I thought that she must have been curious as to examine me as I had been to see her. We sat and ate and talked for hours. I was fascinated by her. She was an uneducated woman, but she held me spellbound with her talk. She gave us details of accounts of the preposterous things Zoila and Zuleika had done when they were mad. As we drove away, Don Juan expressed his admiration for Martha. He said that she was perhaps the finest example he knew of how determination can affect a human being. With no background or preparation at all, except for her unbending intent, Martha had successfully tackled the most arduous task imaginable, that of taking care of Zoila, Zuleika, and Silvio Manuel. I asked Don Juan why Silvio Manuel had refused to let me look at him in the light. He replied that Silvio Manuel was in his element in the darkness, and that I was going to have countless opportunities to see him. For our first meeting, nonetheless, it was mandatory that he maintain himself within the boundaries of his power, the darkness of night. Silvio Manuel and the two women lived together because they were a team of formidable sorcerers. Don Juan advised me that I should not make hasty judgments about the Westerly women. I had met them at a moment when they were out of control, but their lack of control pertained only to surface behavior. They had an inner core which was unalterable. Thus, even at the time of their worst madness, they were capable of laughing at their own aberration, as if it were a performance staged by someone else. Silvio Manuel's case was different. He was in no way deranged. In fact, it was his profound sobriety that enabled him to deal so effectively with those two women, because they were opposite extremes. Don Juan said that Silvio Manuel had been born that way, and everyone around him acknowledged his difference. Even his benefactor, who was stern and unsparing with everybody, lavished a great deal of attention on Silvio Manuel. It took Don Juan years to understand the reason for his preference. Due to something inexplicable in his nature, once Silvio Manuel had entered into the left side awareness, he never came out of it. His proclivity to remain in a state of heightened awareness, coupled with the superb leadership of his benefactor, allowed him to arrive before anyone else, not only at the conclusion that the rule is a map, and that there is in fact another kind of awareness, but also to the actual passageway into the other world of awareness. Don Juan said that Silvio Manuel, in a most impeccable manner, balanced his excessive gains by putting them at the service of their common purpose. He became the silent force behind Don Juan. My last encounter with Don Juan's warriors was with the North. Don Juan took me to the city of Guadalajara to fulfill that meeting. He said that our appointment was only a short distance from the center of town and had to be at noon, because the North was the midday. We left the hotel around 11 a.m. and took an easy stroll through the downtown area. I was walking along without watching where I was going, worried about the meeting. I collided head-on with a lady who was rushing out of a store. She was carrying packages which scattered all over the ground. I apologized and began to help her pick them up. Don Juan urged me to hurry because we were going to be late. The lady seemed to be stunned. I held her arm. She was a very slender, tall woman, perhaps in her 60s, very elegantly dressed. She seemed to be a lady of social standing. She was exquisitely polite and assumed the blame, saying that she had been distracted looking for her manservant. She asked if I would help her locate him in the crowd. I turned to Don Juan. He said that the least I could do after nearly killing her was help her. I took her packages and then we walked back into the store. A short distance away I spotted a forlorn-looking Indian who seemed thoroughly out of place there. The lady called him and he came, oh, I got an ant here. He came, sorry buddy, and he came to her side, like a lost puppy. He looked as if he was about to lick her hand. Don Juan was waiting for us outside the store. He explained to the lady that we were in a hurry, and then told her my name. The lady smiled graciously, and initiated a handshake. I thought that in her youth she must have been ravishing, because she was still beautiful and alluring. Don Juan turned to me and abruptly said that her name was Lydia, and that she was of the north, and that she was a dreamer. He then made me face the manservant and said that his name was Gennaro Flores, and that he was a man of action, the warrior of deeds in the party. My surprise was total. All three of them had a belly laugh. The greater my dismay, the more they seemed to enjoy it. Don Gennaro gave the packages away to a group of children, telling them that his employer, the kind lady who was talking, had bought those things as a present for them. It was her good deed for the day. Then we strolled in silence for half a block. I was tongue-tied. Suddenly Lydia pointed to a store and asked us to wait just an instant because she had to pick up a box of nylons that they were holding for her there. She peered at me smiling, her eyes shining. She told me, all kidding aside, sorcery or no sorcery, she had to wear nylons and lace panties. Don Juan and Don Gennaro laughed like two idiots. I stared at Lydia because I could not do anything else. There was something about her that was utterly earthly, and yet she was almost ethereal. She kiddingly told Don Juan to hold on to me because I was about to pass out. Then she politely asked Don Gennaro to run in and get her order for a specific clerk. As he started in, Lydia seemed to change her mind and called him back, but he apparently did not hear her and disappeared inside the store. She excused herself and ran after him. Don Juan pressed my back to get me out of my turmoil. He said that I would meet the other northerly woman, whose name was Florinda, by herself at another time, because she was to be my link into another cycle, another mood. He described Florinda as a carbon copy of Lydia, or vice versa. I remarked that Lydia was so sophisticated and stylish that I could imagine seeing her in a fashion magazine. The fact that she was beautiful and so fair, perhaps of French or northern Italian extraction, had surprised me. Although Vincente was not an Indian either, his rural appearance made him less of an anomaly. I asked Don Juan why there were non-Indians in his world. He said that power is what selects warriors of a Naguals party, and that it is impossible to know its designs. We waited in front of the store for perhaps half an hour. Don Juan seemed to get impatient and asked me to go inside and tell them to hurry. I walked into the store, but it was not a big place. There was no back door, and yet they were nowhere in sight. I asked the clerks, and they could not help me. I confronted Don Juan and demanded to know what had happened. He said that they had either disappeared into the air or had sneaked out while he was cracking my back. I raged at him that most of his people were tricksters. He laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. He said that I was the ideal dupe. My self-importance made me a most enjoyable subject. He was laughing